I just want to welcome everyone to the Richard Nixon Library. We are so happy to have all of you here. I see it's a packed audience, a packed house, and we're very excited to have you here, and we're very excited for our program tonight. But first of all, I have to say it's great to be among so many friends, friends I've just met, friends I've known for a while, our board members. I see so many of our board members here. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be with so many good friends of Richard Nixon here in Orange County. So thank you for coming out tonight. This program for me is a lot of fun because I get to talk a little bit about my grandfather. And I think one of the exciting things about my grandfather is that he tried and did so many new things. And one thing that he's known for, that I'm so proud of him for, is that his administration actually had more women in higher positions than any other administration prior to his. And in fact, I actually remember a little story when I was just a little kid growing up with my grandfather in Saddle River, New Jersey. And we were talking about presidential politics, of all things, believe it or not, we were. And I said to my grandfather, you know what, I think in 30 years that there'll be a woman president of the United States. And I will tell you, I think there may be one in the House tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Nikki Haley and Congresswoman Mimi Walters to the stage. And will you all please remain standing for the presentation of colors by the Troy High School Navy, Junior ROTC, and then the singing of the National Anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free
And let's give another round of applause to the Troy High School Navy Junior ROTC. And in this particular instance, the all-female honor guard. Congresswoman, Ambassador, the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Well, Ambassador, welcome to the Nixon Library and welcome to Orange County. We are so grateful to have you here and we're looking forward to this evening, so thank you for coming.
Well, and thank you. What a great crowd there is here at the Nixon Library. I mean, what a beautiful place. I had the pleasure of what we called a mini tour, but I could spend days here. It is a stunning library with an amazing record of just the personal, the professional, the before, the after, so much about President Nixon that it really is a treasure here. And so I want to thank all of the team that helped show us such a great time, and help me thank Congresswoman Walters for being here with us today.
Well, thank you. I want to tell you I had the opportunity to read your book. It's very inspirational, so everybody out there, be sure you read the book. It's really inspirational and very educational. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the beginning of the book. And in the first chapter, you describe your American story and how you didn't quite fit in as a brown girl growing up in a black and white world of the South. Can you share with us what that experience was like for you, growing up as a daughter of Indian immigrants in rural South Carolina, and how did it come to shape who you became personally and professionally?
Well, we were the only Indian family in a small southern town. We weren't white enough to be white. We weren't black enough to be black. That town didn't know who we were, what we were, or why we were there. My father wore a turban. He still does to this day. My mother wore a sari. And I remember after playing on the playground and coming home after being teased, and my mom would always say, your job is not to show them how you're different. Your job is to show them how you're similar. And it's amazing how that playground lesson played out in my life, whether it was in the corporate world or as governor or as ambassador, because whenever you're faced with a challenge, if you first talk about what you have in common or what you agree on, everyone lets their guard down. And then all of a sudden you can tackle the challenge. You can get closer to the solution. And so it turned out that it was an interesting way to grow up. You know, I get teased off, and my sister told the story to the press years ago, and I was mortified by it. But you'll see it in the book as well, as they had a Wee Miss Bamberg pageant. And every mother wanted to put her daughters in the Wee Miss Bamberg pageant. It was the thing to do. And so my sister and I were put in it. And they had a black queen and they had a white queen. And we didn't fit. So they disqualified us. And they gave me a beach ball. And my mom said, at least let her practice her talent. She's been practicing her talent. Can she sing her song? You're not ready. The song was, this land is your land, this land is your land. You can't make that up. It's so true. Needless to say, I swore off pageants after that. But what I always tell people is that small town, the state of South Carolina, and America came to accept us. And my father was able to become a professor. My mother was able to start her own business. And only in this country could I be governor and ambassador. And so it shows why this country is so amazingly special, that you're not branded by the circumstances of your birth. It's about how hard you work. And anyone can be anything in this country, which is great.
So true. You talk extensively in the book about the tragic killing of 9 innocent people at the Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in 2015, and this was during the time when you were governor. And that led to the decision to bring down the Confederate flag down from the grounds of the state capitol. Can you tell us about how that incident affected South Carolina and what you did to bring its citizens together during this very difficult time?
It was an incredibly painful time for the state of South Carolina. It was probably the hardest thing that I felt like I went through. It was the first time there had been a shooting in a place of worship in our country, and so it was a shock from that aspect. But what made this so difficult was that we had 12 people who did what so many South Carolinians would do every Wednesday night. They went to Bible study. But on that night, someone else showed up. He didn't look like them. He didn't act like them. He didn't sound like them. Bless you. They didn't throw him out. They didn't call the cops. Instead, they pulled up a chair and they prayed with him for an hour. And when they bowed their heads in that last prayer, he began to shoot. These were people like Ethel Lance, who had lost her daughter 2 years prior to breast cancer and had a broken heart. But she would go around Mother Emanuel cleaning the church, singing, "One day at a time, sweet Jesus, that's all I ask of you. Give me the strength to do every day what I have to do." Our youngest victim, Tywanza Sanders, had just graduated college, had the world in front of him. But on that night, he stood in front of his 87-year-old great Aunt Susie and looked at the killer and said, "You don't have to do this. We mean no harm to you." Or it was people like Cynthia Hurd, whose life motto was simply to be kinder than necessary. That's who these people were. They weren't famous, but they loved their church, they loved their community, and they loved their family. And that brought South Carolina to her knees. All of a sudden, the national media wanted to come in and immediately wanted to define what the situation was. They wanted to talk about it. They wanted to talk about the death penalty. They wanted to talk about racism. They wanted to talk about gun control. And I remember feeling like I just had to keep my arms around the state because this was during the time of Ferguson and all the issues in Baltimore and everything that was going on. And you were watching states get ripped apart. And so, I told the press there will be a time where we can have those conversations, but it is not now. We are going to give honor and respect to the families. We're going to let them go through the funerals, and then we will have those debates. The next day, the killer's manifesto comes out, and there he is in multiple pictures holding the Confederate flag. And I knew at that point that something had to be done. This was difficult for a couple of reasons. This was difficult because to bring down the flag, it would take 2/3 vote, which was already difficult. The second thing is to know the dynamics of South Carolina. You had a group of people who looked at the Confederate flag and they saw it as a symbol of their heritage and service and sacrifice. Then you had another group that saw the Confederate flag and they saw it as hate and they saw it as pain. And to try and reconcile those two groups was going to be incredibly difficult. But basically what happened within a few days after that, the killer presented himself in front of the judge for the first time, and every one of those family members was allowed to speak to him. And they spoke one by one, stood in line, confronted him, and forgave him. It was the kind of just godly spirit that no one could imagine or comprehend. The bill, I wanted to bring the flag down, and I remember calling just a few members of my staff, and I said, I want to have 4 meetings Monday morning. Don't tell them what it's about, but I want to meet with the Republicans. I want to meet with the Democrats. I want to meet with the congressional delegation, and then I want to meet with community leaders. And I knew, I didn't want them to know what the meeting was about because I knew some of them wouldn't come. So when they came to the meeting, I told them, I said, I'm going to have a press conference today at 4 o'clock, and I'm going to ask for the Confederate flag to be brought down. If you will stand with me, I will forever be grateful. And if you won't, I'll never let anyone know that you were in this room. And I had my husband there with me because I thought he might be the only one standing with me at 4 o'clock. So he was a saint to be there. And at 4 o'clock, there was a massive group. You had Strom Thurmond's son, who was a senator. You had African American leaders. You had people come together. The bill quickly passed through the Senate because one of the people that was killed in the church was Senator Pinckney. He was the pastor of the church. And they were brokenhearted that their brother was among the dead, so they passed it quickly in the Senate. In the House, that's where we hit the rough part. And the speaker came to me and he said, okay, he said, we're having a hard time, but we can bring the flag down, but we want to replace it with a different version. And I said, you can't replace it with a different version. It's got to come down. I went back a few days later, came back and said, this has been a struggle, but we're going to bring the flag down. You'll get your win. You'll be able to tell everyone you did it, but they want to leave the flagpole up. Now, I was in the legislature in South Carolina. I knew exactly what that meant. What that meant was as soon as the flag came down and the press left, they were going to put a bill up there that was going to put the flag right back up there. And so he said, that's as good as we can do. We can't do any better. I didn't want this to be on anyone else's back. So I went and I spoke to the caucus. I went to go talk to them, and I said, I want to tell you a story. I said, when I was little, my dad asked me if I wanted to ride with him to Columbia, which was the capital. And I was all excited, and we went. And one of the things he would love to do is stop by produce stands. He loved to buy fruits and vegetables from farmers. We went to the produce stand. He started filling his basket. And I saw the owners by the register start to get nervous. And then the next thing I knew, 2 police cars drove up really fast. They went, they spoke to the owners. The owners, they were all looking back at us. My dad finished getting his produce. He went to the register. He thanked them, paid for it, and we left. He didn't say a word to me the entire way home because he was hoping I didn't notice. And what I told those legislators that day was, even as governor, every time I ride past that fruit stand, I feel pain. And no one should ride by this state house and see that flag and feel that kind of pain. They went back and debated, and the flag came down.
Wow.
And I will say the people of South Carolina stepped up, and we didn't have riots, we had vigils. We didn't have protests, we had hugs. And the people of South Carolina stood up and showed the world what strength and grace looked like.
Well, they had a great leader to lead them, so congratulations on that. You have a great story in the book about how you came to know President Trump and then how you came to support him in the 2016 election. And there was an infamous tweet exchange between the two of you that came somewhere in between. Tell us about the evolution in your relationship with the president.
So I knew the president from my first race for governor. After I won the Republican primary, this white envelope showed up with this gold trim. Inside was a support check, and there was a note that said, "You're a winner." And so I called him and I thanked him, and we were in touch every so often through there. He was an acquaintance. And then the 2016 primary rolls around, and we had a lot of talent on that stage, and I put my support behind a different candidate. And it was at that point where the president tweeted, "Nikki Haley is an embarrassment to South Carolina." And I responded with a tweet that said, "Bless your heart." So I knew that when kicked, he hollered. He knew when he pushed me, I pushed back. And so there was a sort of respect there. He won the primary. I supported him in the general. And then I get a call from Reince Priebus, and he says, "Nikki, the president needs to see you tomorrow in New York." And I said, "For what?" And he said, "He wants to talk to you about Secretary of State." I said, "Reince, I can't be Secretary of State. I'm a governor." And he said, "Well, he wants to talk to you. You need to come." I go the next morning. I walk in his office. First thing he says is, "I guess your guy didn't win." He just can't let anything go. He really can't. So I gave him his moment and let him do his thing. And then I said, "Look," I said, "I'm not your person." I said, "There's a lot going on in the world. You don't need someone, bless you, with a learning curve. And so I would rather, help you find someone that I could support you with." And so we chatted for a bit, and I went back doing the job I loved, which was governing the state that raised me. Fast forward a few days, Reince calls again. He said, "Don't say anything, just listen. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations." I said, "Reince, I don't even know what the United Nations does. I just know everybody hates it." And he said, "Well, the president's going to call you on Monday. I need you to be ready." So I get home. My husband's on the computer and says, "Nikki, I think you'd be really good at this." But it was a tough time. Our son was 15. Our daughter had just started college. My husband and I, we take care of my parents. They live with us. They're both in their 80s, and my mom has Parkinson's. So it wasn't a convenient time to make the move. And so the president called that Monday morning, and he said, "All right, Nick, are you going to do this?" And I said, "Well, there would have to be some conditions in place." And he said, "Okay, what are they?" I said, "Well, I've been a governor. I don't want to work for anyone else. I would want to work directly with you, so it would need to be a cabinet position." He said, "Done. What else?" I said, "Well, I'm a policy girl, so I would want to be in the room when decisions are made, so I would need to be on the National Security Council." He said, "Done. What else?" I said, "Well, I'm not going to be a wallflower or a talking head. I need to be able to say what I think." And he said, "Nikki, that's exactly why I want you to do this." And he was true to his word from the first day to the very last.
That's a great story. Shortly after you arrived in New York, you mentioned that former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger reached out to you and you began meeting regularly with him for lunch. And we all know that Dr. Kissinger was Secretary of State for President Nixon. He gave you some sound advice, and we were hoping you would share with us what his advice was and how it helped you in your new role as UN ambassador.
Well, I just really do have a fondness for Dr. Kissinger because he reached out to me and he never once said, "You should be doing this or that." He just said, "How can I help you?" And so we started having lunch every other month, and I would just talk to him about issues. And what he was so great at was he reminded me that I needed to do the same thing as ambassador that I did as governor, which is understand when you're in a challenge, understand what your opponent's fears are, understand how they're seeing the situation. And so it was very helpful. With the situation with North Korea, it was a frustrating time, and we had to get sanctions put against them, but that meant bringing China on board, which was going to be incredibly difficult. And so as I was debating them, it was because he said that I thought, okay, what is China the most afraid of? And they were afraid of two things: They were afraid of war on the peninsula, and they were afraid that if Kim fell, that all the North Koreans would go into China, and they didn't want that to happen. So it allowed me to go and negotiate with them and say, we're not looking for regime change. That's not where we're going. And look, if we can do this, we think that we can actually make sure that we're not going to have any sort of war. This will work. And when that didn't work, I'd say, I don't know what the president's going to do, so we better get this done. So whenever that was, but Dr. Kissinger's just continued to be helpful. I just had lunch again with him last month, and he will be so excited that I came here because he has the fondest memories of President Nixon.
Yeah. The book is full of stories about working with President Trump as a member of his cabinet. Tell us about what it was really like to have Donald Trump as your boss. Can you shed more light on what your relationship was like behind the scenes?
So everybody wants to know how I got out of the administration without a tweet. And the answer is simple. I told him the truth. If he was doing something good, I supported, I rallied, I did everything I could to help him. If I thought he was making a mistake, I would call or meet with him and say, I don't think this is a good idea. Instead, you should consider X. And he would always say, well, how do you see that playing out? And we would have a discussion. He's actually a great listener and really does welcome opposing views and opinions. So we had a great working relationship, but there was never a dull moment. I'll say that. There was one instance where it was the first UN high-level week that we have. And the high-level week at the UN there's 1 week out of the year where all the senior delegation members from 193 countries come to New York for 1 week to have different meetings on policy. And this was going to be the president's first speech to the UN, because every head of state gives their speech to the world, basically. And so we were getting the week all lined up for him with meetings and everything else, and he and I were constantly either on the phone or meeting in DC. So he called and he said, Nikki, just wanted to check in. How's everything look? And I said, I think we've got you all set up. And he said, did you get my speech? And I said, I did. It was fantastic, and it was. And I said, but Mr. President, I just want you to know what you're walking into. The UN is kind of a different animal. And it's serious. And when you give your speech, it's not going to be like a rally. I said, they're not going to clap for you, but don't take it personally. I said, I want you to think of it like church. And he said, church, got it. He said, well, I wanted to ask you your advice on something. And I said, what's that? He said, what if I referred to Kim as Little Rocket Man in the speech? I said, Mr. President, remember the part I said about church? And he said, I know, but I tweeted it out this morning and it killed on Twitter. It's really catchy. So I said, look, you're the president. I can't promise you what kind of reaction you're going to get, but if that's what you want to do. So fast forward that Tuesday morning, it's time for his speech. North Korean delegations in the front row. And all of a sudden, he says it. And you can see the audience. Now remember, they've got their translator pieces in, right? You can see the audience, they suddenly go. And then they start to laugh. So a few hours later, I'm meeting with the president of Uganda, and he says to me, so tell me, Madam Ambassador, what are we going to do about this little rocket man? By the end of the week, everybody was referring to Kim as Rocket Man.
Well, he certainly doesn't make it dull. Richard Nixon is largely responsible for opening U.S. relations with China. However, he warned us to make sure we keep the country in check. In the last chapter, you talk about some of the issues you've spoken out about since you've left government service. One of those issues you have been very vocal about is China, which you call the greatest foreign threat that America faces. What concerns you about China, and what should Americans be paying attention to?
I do think China is our largest threat, and I think if you look at the story of China and the landscape of where it sits now, they are strengthening their military, so they're a national security threat to us. They are investing all over the world in these little countries, but what is concerning is, and we saw this at the UN, they're running up the debt so high that they can't pay it back. And we saw them go to these countries at the UN and tell them that they had to vote with them. But if they run up the debt, now imagine they go to that country and say, okay, we want your port, or we want to put a military installation, or we want your utility company. Now you look at that map and it will send a chill up your spine. They have been stealing intellectual property ever since we helped them get into the World Trade Organization. It was naive of the U.S. to think that they would start to think like the West, but they have basically been stealing ever since. Almost $50 billion a year we're losing in intellectual property theft. Then you look at the fact they have 1 million plus Uyghurs or Muslims in concentration camps. They are making them change their name, change their religion, change the way they think. If any other country was doing this, the world would be up in arms. But because it's China, no one's saying anything. Then President Xi started a committee. He chairs the committee, and it basically says anyone that's doing business in China, any company that's doing business in China, now has to cooperate with the Chinese military. So think about the tech companies. Think about all the data they have on us. And think about what that means in terms of Chinese military now having access to that. That's just a few of the things that they have started to do. I noticed today I read an article that now the Chinese agencies have said they can't buy or have any foreign computers. So that basically means HP, Dell, Microsoft, all of those are basically getting rid of American computers. It just continues to be a threat. We have the trade deal that's up in play now. I actually think the trade deal is going to happen. Whether it happens before the election or before even Christmas, it's hard to tell. But President Xi needs it for his constituency. Their economy is suffering from this tremendously. President Trump needs it as well. It would be good if they had that. And knowing all of those threats, it doesn't mean we don't do business with China, but we have to let them know we're on to them. And we have to let them know that we're not going to let them get away with the way they've been acting with us in the past.
And the president's been very strong about that. The title of your book is With All Due Respect, which refers to a very public disagreement you had with another member of the administration. What prompted your comment, and why did you think it was important to stand up for yourself in the way you did?
So we had a National Security Council meeting, and it was one where all of us, including the president, decided that we would impose more sanctions on Russia. And this was after the president's been very strong on Russia at this point. He had expelled diplomats. He had already put sanctions down. He had supplied Ukraine with military capabilities and training. So he had really pushed hard on Russia. So this was another set of sanctions that he was going to do. I spoke to him about it the next day. And I only did Sunday shows when the White House would ask. So they asked me to do that Sunday morning show. I went on Face the Nation and said in a conversation, you will see sanctions coming down on Russia if Secretary Mnuchin hasn't disclosed that already. Didn't think anything of it. Stephen Mnuchin calls me that afternoon and says, Nikki, you were right but we have a problem. And I said, what's wrong? He said, the president changed his mind. Now, the president has every right to change his mind. I mean, that's what presidents do. You can decide till the last minute. And so I told Stephen, I said, that's not a problem. Just go say that, make sure that statement gets out. He said, we're going to put out a statement in the morning. Shouldn't be a problem. The next morning, they put out a statement, but they don't quite say that. And it leaves the door open. So the press is calling my office saying, Nikki wouldn't have said this if there wasn't something. There's got to be something there. What's going on? So I called the chief of staff. I called the Secretary of State. I called National Security Advisor Bolton at the time in 3 different conversations, and I said, look, best thing to do is tell the truth. President has every right to change his mind. Just say he changed his mind. He's postponing that action until further notice. And, they kind of just ho-hummed and said, okay. Nothing happened. Tuesday morning, the press is still hounding us, and it's getting worse. I called them and I said, you've got until 5 o'clock today to fix this. Either you fix it or I'm going to fix it, and you don't want me to fix it. Nothing happens, and at 4:45, Larry Kudlow goes out in front of the press, and the press asked the question, which everybody knew they would, and he says, well, I think Nikki got momentarily confused. I was sitting in my office and looked at the television, and the 5 was getting ready to come on Fox. And I called my friend Dana Perino, and I said, can you call me? She called me, and I said, I need it to go on record with a statement. And she said, okay, what? And I said, just say, with all due respect, I don't get confused. She said, that's it? And I go, that's it. I'll text it to you so you have it in writing. But I asked you to say that. And within 10 minutes of her saying that, Larry Kudlow calls me. Nikki, you know I love you. You know I love you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I said, Larry, at what point do you say someone is confused? And I said, nope, let me correct that. At what point do you say I am confused? He said, you're right. I'm so sorry. I'll make it up to you. I promise. I said, you will make it up to me. And I said, you're going to call the press and tell them that you shouldn't have said that. He goes, I can't do that. And I go, oh, you can and you will. And to his credit, within 5 minutes, he was on the phone, he talked to the press, and the whole thing went away. But the lesson to that is no one is going to protect your integrity but yourself. You have to fight for it. When you see something wrong, you have to fix it.
So we're going to take some questions from the audience. So I have one more question for you before we start taking questions from the audience. In the last chapter of the book, you talk about how it seems like America is going through growing pains. What are your thoughts on how polarized our politics have become, and do you think we'll return to a more civil tone and discourse in the near future?
It's really gotten to a bad place. I mean, I think the politics in the country is as toxic as I've ever seen it. And I always say you can tell because if you put down a good piece of legislation, everyone wants to know whose it is before they decide if they're going to support it. That's how we know we've hit a new low. But what bothers me is now you hear both sides referring to the other side as evil. And I've seen evil. I've been to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they use rape as a weapon of war. I've been to South Sudan, where I've talked to a mother whose baby was taken from her arms, and thrown into a fire. She was later forced to eat his flesh. I've been on the Simon Bolivar Bridge and watched thousands of Venezuelans walk across the bridge holding their babies in hand in the hot sun for hours to get the only meal they might get that day. The average Venezuelan adult has lost 24 pounds. I've had to look at images of children that died from chemical weapons from Assad in Syria. That's evil. We have our differences. We should debate them. We should be passionate about it. But we need to remember to be grateful, because on our worst day, we are blessed to live in America.
Amen. Okay, we have a few questions from the audience, and the first one is from the Troy High School Navy JROTC. Thank you, ladies.
How awesome were they today? It
Awesome.
was like so great.
What advice do you have for female youths wanting to get involved politically?
So, not just getting involved politically, but in life. When you're faced with an issue, a decision, or a challenge, push through the fear, because your tendency is to step back. When something presents itself, is to step back. When you lean into it and you push through the fear and you push through that nervous, scary feeling, you find out you're so much stronger on the other side. If I wouldn't have pushed through the fear, I wouldn't have run against a 30-year incumbent in a primary. If I wouldn't have pushed through the fear, I wouldn't have run for governor. If I wouldn't have pushed through the fear, I certainly wouldn't be ambassador. And so when you push through the fear, you live life. If you don't push through the fear, you never know what could have been. So remember to push through the fear.
This question is anonymous. Where do you think the United Nations will be in 10 years?
It's actually a great question, because when I left the United Nations, I said to the Secretary General and I said to my fellow ambassadors there that the future of the United Nations depended on them. If the United Nations is willing to change with the times, I think it could be relevant. But if they continue to be what they are today, which is talking about old, archaic issues and not talking about the things that are uncomfortable to talk about. They need to be talking about, they should have been talking about the protests in Venezuela. They need to be talking about the million Uyghurs in concentration camps. They're not doing any of that. All they want to do is talk about Israel, and all they want to do is bash America. And so if they don't change with the times and start really taking on relevant issues, they won't have a purpose in 10 years. And so it's up to them on whether they want to see that happen or not.
This next question, Nixon said, leaders are often judged by their ability to gauge the national mood, or by their instincts for avoiding no-win issues. Many leaders he met with stood out because of their ability to change the national mood or take an unpopular issue and make it popular. In your career, where do you believe your leadership has made the difference, and why? Got to think about that one, huh?
That's a tough one. I think that there's a few things. There was, when I became a legislator, I've always thrown myself into every job. And in South Carolina, votes typically, when they would happen, legislation that was passed would pass by a voice vote. All in favor say aye, all opposed nay, the ayes have it. But one day there was a piece of legislation that went across the desk that gave legislators pay raises. All in favor say aye, all opposed, silence, the ayes have it. Yet to this day you can't find one legislator that says they gave themselves a pay raise. I got really upset and went to the Speaker of the House and I said, this is why the people don't trust us. I filed a bill the next day that said anything important enough to be debated on the floor of the House or the Senate is important enough for us to have a vote on the record. The Speaker pulled me aside and said, put the bill away. We don't need to have it. We will decide what the public needs to see and what they don't. Now, I remember going home to my husband that night saying, if I can't even get legislative votes on the record, what am I doing here? And he said, then go fight. So I went around the state of South Carolina and said, did you know of all the bills passed in the House, only 8% were on the record? Did you know of all the bills passed in the Senate, only 1% was on the record? So if you didn't know how your House member voted 92% of the time, if you didn't know how your senator voted 99% of the time, how did you know who to vote for when you went to the polls? And the people in South Carolina were shocked. To put this in perspective, my first year in office, I was chairman of the freshman class. My second year, I was majority whip. My third year, I was on a powerful business committee. My fourth year, I was subcommittee chair of banking. The year that I wouldn't put the bill away, they stripped me of everything. I could take the well and no one would listen. I could file a bill and no one would co-sponsor. So I ran for governor. And I'm proud to say that one of the first bills I signed into law is now in South Carolina. Anything debated on the floor of the House or the Senate requires an individual vote on the record, and we took it a step further. We did it on every section of the budget as well.
So we all know who got the last laugh on that one, huh? This is our final question, and it's been such a pleasure to have you, but this one is, who is a figure in world history who you admire?
I mean, I have always just loved the style and the strength of Margaret Thatcher. I just think that she's just a very cool person. And if that wasn't enough, when I was running for governor, I had her quote on the back of my shirt that said, if you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. But you know, I think if you look at her life, she went against the grain in everything. And you know, we think American politics is tough. British politics is really tough. And she just never fell on her conviction. She always did what she knew was right. She always did what she knew was the right thing to do, even if it was unpopular. And so I've always just appreciated that about her. But before we leave, this has been way too much fun, so thank you for that. Before we leave, we have to do a Nixon Library selfie. Because it's what we do, it's what I've done on the book tour. So what we're gonna ask everybody to do is to stand up, hold your book up, and we're gonna do one big selfie, and then you're gonna see it on social media later.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys.